Canada's unexpected move hit the Pentagon like a thunderclap in the middle of a silent night. For decades, Washington had believed its dominance over Allied defense choices was unshakable. The F-35 wasn't just a fighter. It was a weaponized symbol of American superiority, sold to allies as if it were the only path to future air power. But then came a twist that no one inside those high-security Pentagon walls had seen coming: Canada's consideration of Saab's Gripen E. Suddenly, the underdog fighter had stepped into the spotlight, and the world's most powerful military planners were left stunned. Behind the scenes, confusion turned into unease. Why would a loyal US ally even think of abandoning the crown jewel of American air power? The Gripen E wasn't backed by a trillion-dollar defense machine, nor was it celebrated by endless Hollywood-style promotions. It was built quietly in Sweden by a company that had always stood in the shadow of aerospace giants. And yet, this aircraft carried qualities that no one could ignore. It was cheaper, agile, reliable, and capable of operating under conditions that would paralyze the F-35. Canadian planners saw something Washington had underestimated: their vast geography, extreme winters, and budgetary limits demanded a jet that wasn't just high-tech, but also practical. The Gripen could take off from short, icy runways, be refueled and rearmed in minutes by small ground crews, and operate without a sprawling network of high-maintenance infrastructure. It was, in many ways, a fighter designed for survival, not spectacle. As whispers of Canada's interest in the Gripen spread, the Pentagon began to feel something it rarely experiences: fear. Not fear of the aircraft itself, but of the precedent it could set. If Canada, one of America's closest allies, defied the F-35 program, other nations might follow. Norway, Finland, even Germany, countries already questioning the costs and constraints of the F-35, could suddenly have a new option to rally behind. The balance of loyalty could shift. Inside Washington, late-night meetings grew tense. The shockwaves of Canada's move didn't fade overnight. They grew louder with every passing week. Inside the Pentagon, the question no one wanted to ask was now unavoidable. If Canada could resist the pull of the F-35, what would stop others from doing the same? America had spent years tying its allies into a web of contracts, dependencies, and promises. The F-35 was not just a jet. It was a system that forced countries to rely on US software, US spare parts, and US political approval for every upgrade. To walk away from it was to walk away from American influence. That was why Canada's interest in the Gripen E was so alarming. Canadian defense officials had begun laying out their reasoning with quiet confidence. The Gripen's cost was less than half of what the F-35 demanded. Its maintenance required fewer resources, fewer mechanics, and almost none of the expensive US-controlled infrastructure that the F-35 program insisted upon. Even more dangerous for Washington, the Gripen E could be operated with a level of sovereignty that no American jet would allow. Canada could control its own software, make its own upgrades, and adapt the jet without begging permission from Washington. To US strategists, this was a nightmare scenario: the slow unraveling of the strings America had tied around its allies. For Saab, the Swedish company behind the Gripen, Canada's interest was a vindication of decades of work. Their engineers had always believed in designing a fighter that smaller nations could afford, maintain, and trust. They weren't chasing prestige, they were chasing practicality. The Gripen E was proof that air power didn't need to come wrapped in layers of complexity and cost. And now, as Canada's voice grew stronger, Saab's vision was gaining global recognition. Inside the Pentagon's war rooms, whispers of panic began to echo. Intelligence reports suggested that several NATO nations were quietly studying Canada's debate. The fear was not just economic, it was strategic. The United States had built its dominance on more than weapons. It was built on dependency. If allies started believing they could defend themselves without leaning on Washington, then the very foundation of US global power could crack. Canada's flirtation with the Gripen was, in that sense, more dangerous than any missile test by a rival power. Behind closed doors, US defense contractors pushed harder than ever. Lobbyists flooded Canadian media with promises, arguments, and veiled warnings. They claimed the F-35 was the future, that only it could guarantee interoperability with NATO allies, but abandoning it would isolate Canada. But these warnings sounded hollow compared to the hard facts. Gripen E offered freedom, affordability, and resilience. And for a nation like Canada, those qualities were priceless. What unsettled Washington most was the psychology of it. Allies weren't supposed to defy the United States. Not openly, not on matters as serious as air defense. Yet Canada was testing those boundaries. It wasn't just buying a fighter, it was making a statement. A statement that said, we can choose for ourselves. And if that idea took root across Europe and beyond, America's defense empire could find itself facing an enemy it had never prepared for: independence. In the silent corridors of the Pentagon, senior officials began to realize that the Gripen E represented something much bigger than Sweden's aerospace ambitions. It was a symbol of an alternative path, a reminder that even the mightiest power cannot control every choice forever. And for those who understood history, that realization was more terrifying than the jet itself. By now, Canada's quiet defiance had turned into a storm that no one in Washington could ignore. Pentagon officials watched nervously as think tanks, defense analysts, and even European allies began openly discussing the Canadian option. The Gripen E, once dismissed as a minor competitor, was now being framed as the jet of independence, a machine that represented freedom from US strings. For a superpower that had built its influence on control, this was a dangerous narrative. In Ottawa, Canadian politicians were feeling the pressure from both sides. American envoys arrived with promises and threats wrapped in diplomatic language. They reminded Canada of the shared values of NATO, the importance of solidarity, and the risks of stepping away from US-backed systems. Yet at the same time, Canadian pilots who had flown the Gripen whispered their experiences into the ears of decision-makers. They spoke of the jet's lightning agility, the ease of operating it in harsh weather, and its ability to fight without draining the nation's treasury. These voices carried weight, because they came not from politicians, but from those who would actually fly and fight in the skies. For Washington, the most chilling reports weren't about Canada itself, but about the reaction abroad. In Norway, defense officials were quietly re-examining the hidden costs of the F-35. In Finland, military planners who had recently tested the Gripen E began asking whether they had made the right choice by leaning toward US systems. Even Germany, long cautious and bound by politics, had experts questioning whether a cheaper, more versatile option would have been wiser. Canada's flirtation with Gripen had become a spark, and sparks in history often lit fires no one could control. Meanwhile, Saab's executives maintained a careful silence. They knew the storm would grow without their interference. The Gripen E was speaking for itself now, through performance, affordability, and the unease it created in Washington. Every headline, every debate, every rumor only added to its mystique. Saab didn't need to fight America head-on. All they had to do was let America's own doubts grow louder. The Pentagon, however, wasn't going to sit idle. Emergency meeting.
The crisis reached its peak when whispers emerged that Canada's Defence Ministry had begun drafting formal studies, comparing the Gripen E to the F-35, not as a courtesy, but as a serious alternative. For Washington, this was the worst-case scenario. Once numbers, costs, and maintenance realities were laid out in black and white, the glamour of the F-35 would be hard to defend. Facts, after all, don't bend to propaganda. Inside the Pentagon, the mood turned grim. Some senior officials admitted privately what no one dared say in public. The US had overplayed its hand. By locking allies into expensive programs and controlling every wire, code, and spare part, America had created resentment. Canada's interest in the Gripen was simply the first sign of that resentment breaking through the surface. Others feared that if Canada made the leap, NATO unity itself could be threatened. A fractured alliance, where some nations flew US jets and others pursued independence, would be far harder to coordinate in war. But in Ottawa, the conversation took on a different tone. Canada had always lived in the shadow of its larger neighbor, dependent on US technology and US approval. The Gripen E represented something rare, a chance to step out of that shadow. For Canadian politicians, it wasn't just about aircraft performance. It was about national pride. Choosing Gripen meant telling the world, we are not just followers. We can chart our own path. The Pentagon tried one last push. Special envoys were dispatched, offering secret deals, discounts, and promises of political favor if Canada stayed with the F-35. Yet these desperate moves only deepened the sense of mystery. Why was the world's most powerful military acting as if a single Swedish jet could undermine it? Why did Washington sound less like a leader and more like a nervous salesman trying to keep control of a market slipping away? The truth, of course, was far larger than jets or contracts. It was about influence, loyalty, and the crumbling illusion